9 p.m. Melbourne time, Australian Eastern Standard Time. Today's webinar is hosted by the South Asian Institute for Social Transformation, SAIST, based in Dhaka, Bangladesh. The topic is of contemporary importance and perhaps the most featured one in the recent days in media and elsewhere, along with the COVID-19 related news and views. In this webinar, we have a panel of some distinguished persons from the academia, from the research discipline, aid and development sector, and the media itself. While the title of this particular webinar is The Debacle in South Asia, Fallouts, the debacle in Afghanistan, fallouts in South Asia and beyond, we will try to explore today if what happened in Afghanistan is indeed a debacle or not. In the views of the panelists, we'd like to hear from the panelists and from the participants if it's a debacle or if it's a reflection of Afghan people's will. What does this particular event mean? What does it mean to the Afghan people? Many of whom can't even remember a time of peace in their own country. For the younger and the current generation, it is what it is. Peace has been absent for 4 decades. It's the normal way of life. However, the insurgence of militants in various forms and shape brought a variety of social ills that we have seen over that period of time. From poverty, of course, the inter-ethnic strife, we have seen inequality of women very prominently, of course, an absence of modern education, among many other social ills that we can talk about. I will frame today's webinar in a question-answer type of format. And I would like to introduce you, each of you, to be participants in the webinar and ask you some questions. To my distinguished panelists, I would like you to stay as long as you can, because at the end of this webinar, we may have a question answer from the participants, and your presence there will be of utmost importance. So I will start with Professor Amin Saikal. And the other thing I wanted to mention here is that we'll have about 10 minutes time per person. I know people who are here can talk about an hour or more, or even if necessary, but we'll just limit our discussion for 10 minutes if possible. And then at the end, we'll have a Q&A session. Let me introduce Professor Amin Saikal, and if we can have him on the screen in a big way. Professor Amin Saikal is currently the adjunct professor of social sciences at the University of Western Australia, an author of many books which are of contemporary interest. And if I start reading the number of books, it will be a huge list, but some of the important ones I can say. He's the author of Iran Rising, The Survival and Future of the Islamic Republic, Princeton University Press for 2019. He's the co-author of Islam Beyond Borders, The Ummah in World Politics, Cambridge University Press, Modern Afghanistan, A History of Struggle and Survival, Bloomsbury. And Professor Amin Saikal's other books, and if I may say, of very important books, for example, would be the most recent one, the Rise and Fall of Shah, Iran from Autocracy to Religious Rule, the Afghanistan Conflict, Australia's Role, and several other books, actually. There are quite a few. Now, Professor Saikal is a specialist in politics, history, political economy, and international relations in Middle East and Central Asia. And he's a frequent commentator on radio and television. Many of us have seen him and still see him on a regular basis. And he's published numerous articles, international journals, as well as featured articles in major international newspapers, such as the International Herald Tribune, the New York Times, the Guardian, the Australian, and all the other newspapers. Professor Amin Saikal. Now, I've got something to ask you, and I don't know how to start. Now, how do you see really the potential face of Taliban 2, as we say, relative to, let's say, Taliban 1? We have seen a lot of promises made already, promises in terms of equality, transparency, inclusive governance, rights of women and children. We've seen all of these things. We've heard all of these things. What are the implications of the debacle for the future of Afghanistan and the United States? Has US indeed lost to them? US says that they have accomplished a mission and the rest is up to the Afghan people, how they wish to rule or govern their country. I had a conspiracy theory also, wrote somewhere that it was a game that was decided in the players' lounge before. We would like to hear your views on this, Professor Saikal. And how do you see peace coming to Afghanistan, if at all? Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Dr. Khan, and thanks for having me on this panel. I mean, the Afghanistan situation is very tragic. I never thought that I would experience the day when the US president, as the most powerful man on the globe, would ask cooperation from an erstwhile terrorist enemy, the Taliban, in order to be able to evacuate American citizens and allied citizens, as well as a number of Afghan benefactors from Afghanistan. Then what has really transpired is a real debacle. The United States has lost the war in Afghanistan. It is very sad to see that how major powers lose small wars and countries like Afghanistan. And it's going to have serious repercussions, not only for Afghanistan, but also for the United States. For all practical purposes, the United States is not out of the region. This is what a number of countries would have been very pleased to see. And of course, most importantly, they include America's arch adversaries, the People's Republic of China, Russia, the Islamic Republic of Iran. Of course, along with America's loss in Afghanistan, certain allies who had also supported the United States, and that's more important, more specifically, supposedly the world's most powerful military alliance, NATO, has also lost. So it's not just a defeat for the United States, but also a defeat for for NATO. This defeat is much bigger than the one in Vietnam, than the one in Iraq, simply because NATO was not involved in Vietnam. NATO did not support the America's adventure into Iraq. So what does it really mean for the Afghans? They have basically been returned to the theocratic rule which existed between 1996 and 2001. The question is, have the Taliban changed? We have to really look at them at two levels. One is at the level of Taliban leaders. These leaders, over a period of time, have become quite worldly. They've traveled to Doha, They have traveled to other Arab countries. They've traveled to China, to Iran, and of course to Russia. So they have also become very cognizant of some of the mistakes that they made during their previous rule of Afghanistan. They know that Afghanistan is too big and too complex now for them to govern. And therefore, they would need not only international recognition, but also international aid. Therefore, what we have seen, particularly in the last few weeks, a very massive public relations campaign on the part of the Taliban leaders to precisely massage the international community, to give them recognition. Of course, normally states recognize only states under international law. But in this case, because the regime has come to power without any public mandate whatsoever, and without a traditional mandate for that matter, therefore they crave for international recognition and of course international aid. The Taliban lacks the necessary trained manpower and the necessary skilled people in order to run an Afghanistan which has become quite socially, economically, and politically become sophisticated over the last 2 decades. But as far as I can see, the ideology of the Taliban have not really changed. What has changed is their strategic approach and therefore their tactics. But then there's the Taliban at the level of commanders and foot soldiers, who are the ones, they are the ones who are on the ground in Afghanistan. These people have been narrowly educated in Islam, in the madrasas in Pakistan. And they have learned the values and practices of Islam at a fairly rudimentary level. And they have never really experienced city or for that matter, urban existence. They have, most of the time for the last 20 years, they've been in the deserts and the mountains. As far as they're concerned, the only thing which really matters to them is how to put in practice what they had learned in the madrasas. And that's why, whereas the Taliban leadership claims that they are all in favor of forming an inclusive government, the right of women to be educated and work, perhaps a degree of freedom of the press and expression, particularly of media in the country. And they do appear quite sophisticated behind the microphones in order to address the international community. But we hear horror stories from actions of the Taliban commanders and foot soldiers in different parts of Afghanistan. We, even as far as today, we hear that they've asked women to stay at home, not because they don't want a woman to be educated or work, but they say that we also request them to stay at home for their own security. And we hear that people have been dragged out of their houses and they've been punished simply because they were associated with the previous government or they have worked with international forces in Afghanistan. There are so many of these stories that are coming out now, particularly in the last 2 weeks. So as far as I can see, that we are really now at the crossroads. We have to really watch very carefully whether the Taliban leaders maintain their unity and prevail over their commanders and their foot soldiers, or there's going to be a split between them. If there's going to be a split between them, you are likely to see more horror stories coming out of Afghanistan. But let me also at this point say that the Taliban are not the only force in Afghanistan. As you may have noticed from the bomb blast near Kabul airport in the last 24 hours. That has been really carried out by the Khorasan branch of the Islamic State, or what's become known as ISK. The ISK has something like about 2,000 fighters in Afghanistan. And they have been responsible for some of the horrific attacks and casualties, civilian casualties in Afghanistan over the last few years. It was formed in 2015 and became operational in 2016. And quite a number of renegade Taliban have joined this group. Of course, they are in competition with or in rivalry with the Taliban. Taliban don't want them on their turf, but that is another flashpoint, which the Islamic State will probably carry out more suicide bombings, more attacks on the Taliban, more on the civilian targets. And of course, one of the fundamental objectives of the Islamic State in Afghanistan is the same as what it was in Iraq, to ignite a sectarian conflict in Afghanistan between the 80% Shia population of Afghanistan and something like 15 to 20%, 80% Sunni population of Afghanistan and something like about 15 to 20% Shia population of the country.
Professor Saikal, yeah. Okay, I have to stop you here, unfortunately, my apology. Or you can just continue for 30 seconds, perhaps more. Yeah, and we can come back to you. We'll definitely come back to you.
Sure. I just wrap it up in one sentence.
Right.
And I think I don't see the conflict being really halted. I think there's the strong potential for this conflict to continue. But it has very serious implications for the United States, and particularly for the United States policies towards the region, that we will come back to that in order to explain some of those implications. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Saikal. In fact, so fascinating. We could continue for an hour, actually, or more. I would like to hear from you after the question-answer session. Perhaps if you could kindly stay on. Now, I would like to invite an old friend of mine, Chris Blackburn, who is a political analyst, and he and I had the opportunity to work together in relation to the war crime issues in Bangladesh. And Chris is here. I'm very happy, Chris, you are joining from London. Are you joining from London, aren't you? Yeah.
No, I'm joining from the north of England.
North of England, okay. Chris is a famed political analyst. He provides political analysis and advice to development partners, law firms, political campaigns, think tanks, and private organizations. Since 2001, Chris has been working closely with political leaders and security professionals from all around the world. He has worked closely with the investigative teams for the 9/11 Families United to Bankrupt Terrorism lawsuit. He has helped organize IntelCon 2005 and the Intelligence Summits, two prestigious forums for security and international relations based in the United States. Mr. Blackburn has worked on projects in North America, Europe, Middle East, and South Asia concerning politics, extremism, and terrorism. Chris has worked closely with producers and researchers from major news organizations and think tanks, providing analysis and research results for the BBC, Channel 4, Deutsche Welle, the Washington Times, Voice of America, and numerous South Asian media groups. Mr. Blackburn has been a leading campaigner for the trial of suspected war criminals associated with Bangladesh's War of Liberation. He was given the honor of a friend of Bangladesh by the Liberation War Ministry in Bangladesh a few years ago. Chris, my question to you, because you worked on terrorism, extremism, politics, what do you think are the ramifications of global security with Pakistan and China being in the driving seat in South Asia, and perhaps Russia watching from the sidelines? Why is the fall of Kabul symbolic for the Taliban, and why is it being celebrated in Pakistan? Can you help us with some of these answers, please, Chris? Thank you.
Well, I think to start with, the global ramifications for security, with obviously Pakistan and China now taking the driving seat, we need to explore on all these different fronts in the South China Sea. We've got alliances, the Quad Security Alliance with India, United States, Australia, and Japan. A lot of American allies are beginning to question Americans' judgment, and also questioning sort of Joe Biden and American leadership resolve. If we're going to create security alliances, we need to be able to give confidence and to be able to plan and have forward thinking. And I think even the Pentagon and leaders in the United States are beginning to question the US President Joe Biden's sort of resolve, and not only that, but his strategic thinking. So this is one of the main factors. There are probably two factors that have come out of this debacle in Afghanistan, and that is that US leadership is pretty feckless, and also that Pakistan's behavior after 20 years after 9/11, they haven't really changed. So these two factors, I think, are very important going forward for global security. A lot of Indian analysts, national security analysts, are they're getting to the point where they're beginning to push conspiracy theories that perhaps there were backroom deals. Like, why is the why is the Taliban being presented as this sort of counterweight to ISIS in Afghanistan? Like, literally, we've had less than a week of them being in control in Kabul. So I think the ramifications of this is that we need global leadership. Unfortunately, the US is an imperfect partner, and has dominated sort of global security for the last 50, 60 years. And the US having this sort of existential crisis, leadership crisis, has left its allies thinking, well, do we have any resolve? Is the US going to pull out in other places? How is Taiwan going to react? If China is pushing Taiwan, is the US going to say, well, it's a small country, we don't really need it, and we don't really need to protect it. We don't really need to fight for people who are wanting freedom. And the Afghanis at the minute are not only are they heartbroken and in despair, but they are thinking, well, who's going to be in their corner? So I think we've got all these different ramifications, and especially with Pakistan, from the Prime Minister Imran Khan, what he basically said is, as the Taliban were taking Kabul, is that they're now getting rid of the shackles of slavery. The Afghan people were freeing themselves. I don't see anything to do with the Taliban that has anything to do with freedom or liberty. So for Pakistani ministers, and especially the Prime Minister, to be saying this, I think it's worrying. And I think the international community have put so much effort into helping the Afghans over the last 20 years that we've got to sanction Pakistan. Their behavior, we know that they've been behind the proxy wars. We know the ISI were behind the Mumbai attacks. We know that Pakistani diplomats have been kicked out of Dhaka for giving money to Al-Qaeda, to giving money to the people that were killing bloggers in Bangladesh. And they were kicked out. We know it. We have evidence. So for the international community to turn a blind eye to Pakistani behavior, I think has been one of the biggest sort of failures in sort of last 20 years, and it's US leadership, feckless leadership, that's caused that. So I think with Pakistan and how they're gloating about the fall of Kabul, I think we simply need to make them accountable for their behavior. And that is, going forward, it's going to be all about monitoring and making sure that when people's behavior is outside of the international norms, that we've got to make them accountable.
Chris, thank you very much. You stay on the line kindly. We might want to hear from you later on if you have the question answer session, if you could stay on for a while. Thank you very, very much, Chris. It's a different perspective. Now, I'd like to invite Jovitta Thomas. Unfortunately, we talk about female parity, gender parity, all of these things here. But in our panel today, we have got only one person, Jovitta Thomas, only one female participant in the panel. But that doesn't really matter because, I think we will hear from her and we will make sure that, we all are conscious of gender parity in our future work. Jovitta is an Indian national. She lives in Tbilisi, Georgia. I don't know how to pronounce that city's name. Have you done it right? Okay. Now, Jovitta is a community development specialist who has worked in almost all parts of Afghanistan to the remotest corner. And she is specialized in working in fragile and areas of conflict. She has worked for the United Nations, the World Bank, and directly with the governments, largely in the Balkans and Afghanistan. For the past 17 years, Jovitta has served as a senior advisor for development economy, for development projects actually, in Afghanistan's Ministry of Municipalities and the Ministry of Economy, and for the rural rehabilitation and development kind of activities. She focuses on helping new transitional governments to design and implement large development initiatives covering local governance, poverty reduction, community development, conflict management, and public service management. She recently has worked in the World Bank social development sector, supporting, among others, a very contemporary subject, the COVID-19 socio-economic response, and that was in Afghanistan. Jovitta is also a Yale World Fellow for 2020, primarily for her community-driven development work in conflict zones. So we welcome you, Jovitta, to this webinar. My question to you, as I said at the very beginning, we have got a combination of, political analysts, researchers, academicians, and also development specialists. So Jovitta, my question to you is, as a community development person who has worked in, as I said, all nook and corner of Afghanistan, how do you see the change for women in Afghanistan between 2001 and 2021 with the arrival of Taliban 2.0? You have seen many of these changes also in the meantime. Will all Afghan women be affected similarly by this Taliban 2 takeover? The Taliban 2 has announced that women will be allowed to work and study under what they say the framework, quote unquote, of Sharia law. What does it really mean to you? Kindly feel free to comment on these issues in the context of your development exposure. Thanks.
Thank you. Glad to be part of this panel. Let me also frame this in the light that I lived in Afghanistan for 12 years, and for the past 4 years, I go in for around 2 to 3 weeks every month. Unlike most expats in Afghanistan who live in gated compounds with heavy security and never see the real Afghanistan, as an expat, I'm very privileged to have traveled the length and breadth of the country, 29 of the 34 provinces, right down to the villages, from Badakhshan to Nimros, from even what we call the the Taliban heartland in Kandahar, Uruzgan, Zabul, these provinces. So I'm speaking not as one of those, as Afghans sometimes disparagingly call Karijis, the foreigner experts who sit in their silos and talk. I'm talking as someone who's actually seen these communities. To respond to your question, let me take a little bit of a historical perspective, because we always talk about, and why I'm saying this is an oft forwarded meme that you see in the media today, in the social media today, is an Afghan woman in mini skirts on one side, and then an Afghan woman in burqa on the other side, and they label it as Afghan women in 1970s and Afghan women in 2021. And it irritates me. It makes me even mad sometimes to see that. So let me try and give you a little bit of a historical framework. King Amanullah from 1919 to 1929 tried to bring in the most number of social reforms in his country. And the social reforms included a lot of rights for women. And he pushed to the extent that he wanted to give women rights that he saw women enjoying in Europe, and even more advanced than that. And his Queen Soraya, started the first girls' school in Kabul. But what it resulted in is the tribal belt, the tribal leaders were so anchored by the reforms that he brought in that he was ousted from government in 1929. So he ruled only for 10 years, and his progressive thinking was too much for the tribal belt to take. A few years later, 1933, King Zahid Shah came on board, the last king of Afghanistan. From 1933 to 1973, 40 years of King Zahid Shah, who also introduced a lot of women's rights, women's reforms, including a constitution in 1964 that gave women the right to vote. Again, he was also a progressive thinker, but he was far more cautious than his predecessor, King Amanullah, and he tried to introduce those changes gradually. Again, there was backlash. A lot of tribal leaders would not accept it. So first thing we need to set in context is that all the so-called repressive state that the Western media likes to project on the Taliban alone was not exclusively in the Taliban period. Even prior to the Taliban period, prior to 96, there were whole pockets of Afghanistan in the south and the southeast where women were Afghans in the south and southeastern states were from traditional societies where women's mobility was limited. Women's ability to access areas outside the home without a mahram was limited. So it was not just a Taliban phenomenon. Okay, now we all know what happened in between 1996 and 2001, much touted in the media about how all women's rights were removed by the Taliban. Now let's talk about since then. 2018, Afghanistan was declared as one of the worst places to be born a woman. It's a very tragic phrase to be put forward. One of the worst places on earth to be born a woman. Does that mean there was no reforms for women between 2001 and 2018 or just before the Taliban took over into August 15th? No, there was a lot of improvements, Today, I'm seeing one young participant here from the Kabul University. Like her, there is between 50,000 and 60,000 young girls going to universities around the country, something that we couldn't have imagined back in 2001 under the Taliban regime. We have women prosecutors, we have women judges, we have women human rights activists. We have more women parliamentarians in Afghanistan, 28%, compared to all the neighboring countries where we have far lower. In my country, we have around 14% of the parliament of women. And if you compare all the neighbors, thanks to the quota or reservation system, Afghanistan's parliament has more women. Women on TV, women on local media, women on journalists. The improvements are extremely vast. But does that actually present a more rosy picture than we should believe in? Afghanistan's women still are among the most, for lack of another word, English is not my first language, oppressed women in the world. The Gender Inequality Index for 2019, which was the last year it was done, it ranked 167 countries. And of 167 countries, Afghanistan was ranked 157th. So 157 of 167 is a very dismal picture. So the gender inequality gap measures the privileges that a man enjoys versus a woman in a certain country for basic care and services, health, longevity, education, access, and all of those indicators. When you look at the UNDP's Human Development Indices, the HDIs, Afghanistan is again ranked among the 20th from the bottom. So 169th of 189 countries ranked in 2019, or what we call the HDIs 2020. So in women's mortality rate, okay, mortality rate is, just to give you a quick definition, it is how many women die in childbirth out of 100,000 live births. Okay, how many women die in childbirth? And Afghanistan ranks among the worst, with over 630 women on average dying is the mortality rate in Afghanistan. Compare that to my state in India, which is Kerala, we have 43 women. Or in the whole of India, it is 145 women. So when you put it in perspective, 630 plus women die in childbirth in Afghanistan. So Afghanistan, even prior to the August 15th, was a place that was very challenging for women. Now, that is not to dismiss all the achievements that women and the international community did for women between 2001 and 2021. Now, coming to your second part of the question, are all women going to be equally affected by the Taliban takeover? Afghan women are not a homogeneous group, so obviously not. To be very frank, the most affected will be the urban, educated, working women in Afghanistan. As the earlier panel member already mentioned, the Taliban have politely asked women working in government to stay home until they educate their own leaders, Taliban, to treat women better. Whether that ban from working will stay or not, yet remains to be seen. I know university students like our young friend here who are, though they're not banned officially by the Taliban from going to university, are too scared to go to university anymore. In the few universities that are open, I heard firsthand that the women have been asked to move to separate classroom. In some universities, there's a screen put between the male students and the female students. In the women politicians, I know the senior politicians who were deputy ministers, advocates, prosecutors, human rights activists, they're all trying to escape the country one way or other out of sheer fear and desperation for what the Taliban version 2 will look like. Coming to the last part of your question on whether, what do they mean by saying that women will have all rights under the Islamic framework of the Sharia law? I would love to hear from them, but to give them due credit, this is exactly the same thing they said when they started negotiating with the US from 2019. We as the international community have to take the responsibility for not pushing them at the negotiation phase, for asking them, what did they mean? What did they mean? What did this women's right to education work under the Islamic framework of Sharia law mean? If it was not the version that we saw from 1996 to 2001, how different is it? It wasn't that part of the Sharia framework, Sharia law. Many of you are much better experts in Sharia law than I am. But the way it is interpreted in Iran, and the way it is interpreted by the Wahhabi sect in Saudi Arabia, and the way it's interpreted by the IS Khorasan in Afghanistan are all very different interpretations of the same law. So which version were they talking about? And the thing that bothers me most, when 2001, August 15, when the news headlines reached everywhere, the Taliban has taken over Kabul, Kabul fell peacefully, the current government has vacated in a vacuum. The thing that I heard international journalists from CNN to BBC to Washington Post to New York Times asking the Taliban commanders was one thing on women's rights. Will women have to wear the burqa to go out? Will women have to wear the hijab to go out? Why not ask the right questions? Why not ask if women will have the right to work? Will women doctors, women prosecutors, women human rights activists be able to continue their trade or their profession or their training without recrimination? No, we didn't ask that question. We were more bothered about our Western liberalized norms about wearing the burqa as a sign of oppression. I think we need to stop us seeing those symbols, outwardly symbols, and look at factors where we can actually promote women's rights in Afghanistan. Can we protect the women who work for the governance institute? just also to show the hypocrisy of the international community, I worked for a project where we were electing something equal to India's panchayat system. We were electing little shuras or community development councils in each village across 35,000 villages in the country. Mukherjee Sahab has come and visited some of those villages and even written about them. So what we tried to promote was 50% quota system for women members. We were trying to push the norms where it is possible for women to participate, either in a separate body or jointly, but with equal participation. But we always knew there were parts of the country where it was not feasible, and we made exceptions for those. And we had international donors, especially the US, women senators and women parliamentarians from the US would come back and say, absolutely not. We need to have 50% participation in Helmand. We need to have 50% participation in Uruzgan. When you push a token reservation system, projects, the Afghan government, even the Taliban, will do everything they need to tick off the box. We used to call those bale forms.
But that's a fallacy of development, unfortunately, Jovitta. And I, being also a development student and worker, I've seen this fallacy all throughout. Thank you very much. We'll come back to you perhaps a little later. Now, I would like to invite Dr. Amitava Mukherjee, who, as you can see, is dressed in Afghan outfit. He is an economist, and a very short description. If I asked him, how do I introduce you? He said, just say that a delinquent economist and a development practitioner without borders. Actually, that is the case. Dr. Mukherjee is an internationally recognized scholar and development practitioner, basically in the area of food security, hunger, and poverty reduction. He has worked extensively in Afghanistan, China, Southeast Asia, and Central Asia. And he was also an advisor to the United Nations Economic and Social Commission for Asia and Pacific, ESCAP. I don't want to go on and on. My question to you, Dr. Mukherjee, is you have worked in Afghanistan in both Karzai government and Ashraf Ghani's regime. And I think Jovitta Thomas must have also done so. Now, what is the situation of hunger in Afghanistan, perhaps now, during the last regime, and to non-Taliban time, and perhaps how do we see the state of hunger coming given the current situation in Afghanistan? We don't know when and through what means peace will return to Afghanistan. Can the general people, especially the poor people, participate in the development process, and which is a precondition of development outcomes, as we all know, if peace returns to Afghanistan? Unfortunately, I have to give you another just 10 minutes or maybe a little less. Yeah, so please, Dr. Mukherjee, thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Khan. Can you hear me?
Yes, very loud and clear. Thank you.
Well, I have not read much about Afghanistan, so I will tell you what I saw in certain parts of Afghanistan that I worked. I didn't unlike Jovitta, I have not worked in all parts of Afghanistan, but fairly good amount of places I've worked in Takur, in Badakhshan, in Rustak, Mazar-e-Sharif, Jajwan, Herat, Kabul, and Varsaj. I will tell you what I saw there. If you look at this secondary data, they say that 44% of the people in Afghanistan are poor, according to poverty line. And according to the World Food Program, 1 in 3 Afghans are hungry. Now, when are food insecure? When we say they're food insecure, a country is food insecure, or a country is food secure, if we put it positively, it would imply that there are enough food in the system. Food comes from 2 sources. One is cultivated, the other is what is given by nature, and we call that food from the secondary system, from forest, from rivers, from grazing land, what have you. People have, the food that is consumed is nutritious. People have potable drinking water, And there are no social barriers to accessing food, right? Like in an Indian household, I'm sure in many other parts of the world, the intrafamilial distribution of power determines how much food a woman will have. Now, I will tell my findings in all these places were that availability for food is a serious concern. They don't produce enough food for the consumption of the entire family. Therefore, they have to buy food. But the purchasing power available with the people to buy food is limited. The employment opportunities are limited. In fact, the data from yesterday, one of my friends, Jovitta, Raghavan, he's very much into it, telling me that the price of flour has increased from 1,000 rupees, I'm talking and offs, to 2,200. A 5-liter can of edible oil costs 750 off from 500 off. It can be, this stuff can exchange problem can be there. Therefore, what has happened is that because of the conflict situation, prices have gone up. If prices have gone up, I'm not talking of the access yet, prices have gone up, people are economically cut off, or at least the power to access food economically has been reduced dramatically. Add to this the fact that people don't have access now, not all of them, many of them don't have access to outlets. For instance, my discussion yesterday with some of my friends in Afghanistan was that many of the shops are closed. The shops in alleys and small lanes are open, what we call mom and pop shops. Supply lines will soon be cut off. The current supply of food is from the stocks they are holding. Therefore, food security situation is dire. The saving grace is that in Afghanistan, there is a considerable amount of food and nutritious food which is available from the secondary food system. They have access to wild fruits, wild nuts. Interestingly, if you see it in Takat, there are forests of pistachio, and they are common property resources, and a village or a community is allocated a particular portion of the pistachio forest to harvest for 7 days. They can harvest whatever they want to harvest for 7 days and then leave it. Some other group will come. So the secondary food system secondary food that they get, they're nutritious food. So the nutrition level is certainly taken care of to a certain extent. But that is lopsided. A person to be food secure needs to have starch, proteins, and green stuff. What a great food security expert used to tell me, your plate must be colorful, a natural color, you have everything. That's the difficulty. So the food security situation is not very rosy. If the World Food Program had said that every 1 in 3 Afghan citizen is food insecure, I think it's going to increase even more. The second issue in food security is the access issue. Jovitta said so well. Women will no longer, they're discouraged to work outside their homes, as the Taliban have asked them to stay in the home and not come to office. So the income level of women will go down further, which has a very strong implication on food security. So overall, the food security situation was bad. 1 in 3 Afghanis were food insecure. Though the saving grace is that the secondary food system added to their palate and nutrition. But the current situation I don't think the conflict is going to, everybody knows, it's not going to be over soon. So access to food will be a major issue, both in terms of physical access and economic access. Now, on the question of the second question, how far they can participate. Well, right now we are talking in a stateless country. The Taliban is not a government, as the first speaker mentioned. It's a group. And a group which is a powerful group which can now dictate terms to the United States. So it is not a government. Therefore, when they will leave, a government there is a certain amount of certainty. If it is a democratic government, we know that in 4 years or 5 years, it will go. In case of this Taliban, who control now the entire political space, we don't know how long they will stay. They can stay for eternity or they can stay for a small number of years, I do not know. And as the first speaker, Amin Saikal said, there are many groups in Afghanistan which are fighting for power, like ISIS. Also, one has to be very careful to know there are traditional leaderships in Afghanistan also. The Arbabs, some of them hold considerable sway over the water available. Some of them hold considerable sway over the common property resources. Some of them hold considerable sway over the land available. So therefore, it's a complex situation of leadership. In such a situation, how far the people will be allowed to participate in the development process is doubtful. But between 15 and 19, when I worked there, the people did participate very, very strongly. I was evaluating the National Solidarity Program once, and people's participation, despite being a very traditional society, was significant. And they understood the nuances of democracy. They understood the nuances of participation, and they did look at the advantages that they have. So if you sum up quickly, if a government comes to power, situation might change. But as of now, there is no government, and if there is no government, there is no state, according to our political theory. Therefore, in such a situation, participation of the people in the development effort is doubtful.
Yeah, doubtful. Thank you very much, Dr. Mukherjee. We are very pleased that you could make some time, and if you have little extra time, please stay on with us, and we might have some questions from the audience. Now, I would like to invite Dr. Zayed Ahmad, who is a research fellow at Alfred Deakin Institute, Deakin University, Melbourne. Now, why Zahid is here? Zahid is a person who has been studying peace and security in South Asia, and especially in the context of regional cooperation. And with also, he has done a lot of work in relation to Afghanistan. Besides his research on the role of intergovernmental organizations in Afghanistan, he has done research and published on geopolitical and proxy dynamics, with specific reference to Afghanistan's relationship with Pakistan. He's the author of the book called Regionalism and Regional Security in South Asia, The Role of SAARC. Zahid, this SAARC thing is a very close to my heart, but it's a dead entity, definitely for sure. And it has been dead for a long time. Afghanistan hasn't been a member of SAARC until 2007, when they were embedded into SAARC as one of the South Asian member countries. I'm not even sure whether Afghanistan falls under South Asia or any other regional entity. Whatever the case is, it's the 8th partner of SAARC. And I would like to ask you, Zahid, a question. And basically, this is the question which is also the title of our webinar. How do you see the Afghan events impinging on extremism, terrorism, and the future of Talibanization in South Asia and beyond? And perhaps also in relation to OIC and the Shanghai Cooperation Organization, And do you also see that this has got ramification in Central Asia, such as Kyrgyzstan, Tajikistan, and Kazakhstan? So on to you, Zahid. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Hello to everyone. And firstly, I thank the South Asian Institute for Social Transformation for hosting this very timely event. You have asked actually very difficult questions. And the first part is easy because if you look at the interests of, for example, Central Asian republics, you look at Russia, China, through the Shanghai Cooperation Organization, especially they have been actually focusing on dealing with extremism, radicalization, and terrorism with a focus on Afghanistan for some time. And with the presence of Islamic State of Khorasan, even Iran had concerns on that. So these regional actors, in a way, had a similar sort of point of view on these issues. But when it comes to the role of regional organizations, you talked about SARC being an ineffective organization. I don't have a different point of view on that, but I'll try and present my own analysis of the situation and why there is a need for a regional approach, most of all. Because I've been studying proxy dynamics for a number of years. And one reality in the case of Afghanistan is that it has always been at the mercy of similar or divergent interests involving regional actors. And we have seen that to some proxy engagements. And in recent past, we can say that all regional actors were or have been in favor of the US troop withdrawal, apart from India. Considering that and also other emerging geopolitical dynamics, one important one being that is the China's increasing influence in South Asia and beyond, and how India sees that through the lens of string of pearls or through some kind of interference in its sphere of influence. Is those dynamics are also going to play an important role. And now talking about the situation in Afghanistan, I think what has helped the Taliban is their diplomatic connectivity or engagement that happened leading up to the US Taliban peace deal. And while I also argue that the peace deal itself has legitimized the Taliban, because if you look at the deal closely, they're referred to as the Islamic Emirate of Afghanistan and not the Taliban. So in my opinion, that played an important role, not just in legitimizing the group, but also in giving them more confidence in terms of gaining more through intra-Afghan peace dialogues. And that could be one reason that those dialogues never led to any meaningful conclusion. But when we look at their external engagement, we look at that, in recent years, they have established links with Russia, China, Pakistan, of course, historically, they have maintained their links, but also Iran and Qatar. And, some of, most of these countries have their embassies or diplomatic presence still in Kabul. Pakistan's embassy, in fact, is working overtime, issuing visas, and also helping Western countries in their evacuations. So there's that dynamic as well. But looking at overall this, regional picture complex, one can see that there are many countries with interest or stake in Afghanistan. So what is the way out? I'll focus more on solutions by looking at, some of the possibilities out there, and also keeping in mind the history of proxy dynamics in Afghanistan. It is important to focus on regional or and extra-regional organizations, in my opinion, because the clash of interests between India and Pakistan in Afghanistan, there's credible evidence available on that. India, since 2002, has invested a lot in Afghanistan. It won't like to let it just go away that easily. Something Pakistan, I think, understands very well as well. That in Islamabad, whether someone likes it or not, the understanding has changed a lot. Pakistan is very much in favor of now. The rhetoric that I'm seeing coming out of Islamabad is in favor of a regional approach. In fact, the foreign ministry announced holding a regional conference. Pakistan's foreign minister just, I think, today or yesterday landed in Tehran. He was in Central Asia before that. and before that in China. So they are actually working on a regional approach. And also there is also this understanding and openness to also engage India in the process. Okay, because I think the leadership has learned from the past that just, you know, like in the past, you know, when there was Islamic Emirate of Afghanistan, there were only 3 countries that recognized them. There was Pakistan, Saudi Arabia, and the UAE. So Pakistan, I think, has learned a lesson that it's important to bring in more actors. And we saw also recently, after an attack on the Chinese citizens of Pakistan, Islamabad basically told Beijing to talk directly to the Taliban, because they know that now their leverage in terms of influencing Taliban is going to reduce, because many of the Taliban families are going to return and their leaders as well from Pakistan. So that will change. Let us now talk about SAARC. I think SAARC has largely been ineffective because of political differences, mainly involving India and Pakistan. Ideally, for example, I often give this example that SAARC should have organized 37 annual summits, meetings of heads of state, one every year, but it has only managed to organize 18 so far. And why? Because, you know, regular cancellations, and the last one was to take place, the 19th summit was to take place in Islamabad in 2016, could not because a number of countries pulled out of it, including Afghanistan, India, and Bhutan. And there was, you know, after the Kargil war, there were cancellations, but at the same time, SAARC, you know, I'm still hopeful. I don't completely have a very pessimistic view of that, because if you look at certain important breakthroughs, when General Musharraf walked over to Vajpayee, that actually paved the way for peace dialogues between India and Pakistan, the longest ever that I can think of, and on all issues, including the Kashmir issue as well. But still, and Afghanistan is a member, so there's some hope that SAARC could play some role. But that largely depends on the role of India, or in India's interest, because everyone in SAARC has a veto power. So if one member state disagrees to something, it's not going to go ahead. And India, for the number of years, especially under the Modi administration, is trying to isolate Pakistan in South Asia and beyond. And we have seen SAARC suffering because of that. So now I'll move to the Shanghai Cooperation Organization, because India and Pakistan have also become its full members, and Central Asian republics are its members alongside Russia and China. So definitely most of its member states have interest in Afghanistan, and that's why they have this Afghanistan contact group actually working for a number of years within the SCO. And in my opinion, that is something that could be revived. But again, you know, like SCO is also suffering because of these geopolitical realignments. We have seen India joining Quad, for example, and India recently did not participate in the SCO's military exercise that took place in Russia. So again, there are some divisions within the SCO as well. And finally, I think most hopeful could be the case of the OIC. Despite the fact that China, Russia, and India are not members of the OIC, but I think many of the countries that have interest or stake in Afghanistan, they are members, like Pakistan, Iran, Saudi Arabia, and Turkey. Turkey was actually very much interested in providing security to the Kabul airport, something on which there was, of course, no decision made, and we have seen the ramifications of that, because there was just chaos after the Taliban took over. OIC's track record in terms of conflict resolution is not very, I won't give it, you know, 10 out of 10, but maybe 5 out of 10. I'll conclude. I'm getting your signals. So
no, that's okay, Zahid. Yeah, sure. No, it's not the signal part only. I was also at the same time affirming some of the things that you were saying. But anyway,
okay.
Thank you. Look, I mean, we can come back. Actually, okay. I'm still not very hopeful as you are in terms of the SAARC's future. And I always said, you know, I used to work very close to the SAARC Secretariat in Kathmandu many years ago, and I've seen it was, in my view, and I can see here, Abul Hassan Chaudhry is here, our ex-foreign minister here. Now I can see his face from London.
State minister.
State Minister, yes. I always had said that SAARC is the extension of the foreign ministries of each of the countries, the member countries. Excuse me for that. But anyway, let me go to the next speaker. And the speaker is Nadeem Malik. Nadeem is senior lecturer, Faculty of Social and Political Science. Actually, he's with the Development Studies program with the University of Melbourne. Nadeem is, he's got many things. I'm not going to tell you everything about him. He's definitely a person who follows the geopolitical situation and writes a lot on the regional aspects and Afghanistan conflict situation and development in conflict economies, globalization, state and civil society. Another aspect of Dr. Malik's, Nadeem Malik, which is very important, and I will have to ask him a question along that line. He is a very, very good painter, artist. And it's not just he's an amateur. He has his formal training in fine arts. You know, if he was not teaching at the University of Melbourne, he could be a very good painter. I've seen his paintings. He is also a prolific tabla player and disciple of Tariq Khan. Fantastic to be really, really good. And I have to ask him a question. How does he see the future of music and art in Afghanistan? Long history, long cultural heritage of art, music, painting, and all of these things. Where are we taking all of these things towards? That's the question I have to ask him. But also on a much serious note, Nadeem, I have been following Afghanistan. You have been following it very closely, and I've been following your writings. Recently, I've seen your writing is on how Pakistan stands to gain or lose from the Taliban's victory in Afghanistan. Pakistan has long played a critical yet confusing role in Afghanistan. Pretty confusing role in many ways. It has been one of the strongest US allies in its war on terror, yet it has also covertly backed the Taliban in its fight against US-led forces for years. Pakistan officials called for peaceful settlement through an inclusive government, and the Taliban spokespersons repeated this like a parrot, while the Pakistan's prime minister, as somebody else said, declared that Afghans had broken the shackles of slavery, which seems to aim the US establishment. How do you comment on this paradoxical position of Pakistan, Nadeem?
Well, look, this is a paradoxical situation in the sense that, you know, on one hand, you get an official statement from the foreign minister that, you know, that the Pakistani government seeks for a very peaceful and more inclusive, broad government, you know, formed through broad-based consultation with all stakeholders and ethnic groups. And the military chief in Pakistan recently in a televised message urged or hoped that, you know, Afghan Taliban would respect the international commitment for women's rights and human rights. But at the same time, Imran Khan, who I consider as a mini Trump, you know, mini Donald Trump, can say anything. You know, when he speaks, you know, he speaks first and thinks later on. So I think this was a kind of slip of tongue or whatever, or his loose talk. But official position of Pakistani establishment. I mean, foreign policy has always been devised by Pakistani military establishment, and they definitely want, right, like other regional powers in the region, a stable Pakistan for their, because they are seeing this as an opportunity to develop a new economic hub which can benefit all regional powers. So I would take more seriously the foreign minister, who definitely have given a statement in consultation with the military establishment and the chief of the army staff. And I wouldn't take Imran Khan's statement that seriously at all. but broadly, most of Zahid has sort of covered most of the things. But I would broadly say that in view of the Pakistani establishment, what Pakistan has gained most is that India would not have influence on Afghanistan now, which was seen as a threat to Pakistan's security. And it also provides inroads to Pakistan to improve its trade with Afghanistan and unrestricted trade routes to Central Asia, because for definite historical reasons, Pakistan still has a sway over Taliban. However, if Taliban, fail to ensure stability, it can trigger massive problems, ranging from a flood of refugees to a resurgence of domestic terrorism, linked to the insurgents killing thousands of Pakistanis. Other aspects are covered by other panelists quite eloquently. I would now focus on your second question, about the future of art and music in Afghanistan. When Taliban seized power in Afghanistan previously in 1996, they imposed an extremist version of Islamic law across the country, and they tried to erase all traces of a rich pre-Islamic past and ordered, the destruction of ancient statues, including the world's tallest standing Buddhas. The statues were, blown up and destroyed in March 2001 by the Taliban on orders from leader Mullah Muhammad Umar, after the Taliban government declared that they were idols. But this is not new in Afghan history. If I could take you back into the 16th century, the Emperor Babur wrote in his Baburnama, in 1528, that he ordered both these statues to be destroyed. Later, the Mughal Emperor Aurangzeb tried to use heavy artillery, to destroy these statues, and the legs of the Buddhas were broken because of Aurangzeb's action. Another attempt to destroy the Bamiyan statues was made by the 18th century Persian king, Nadir Afshar, directing cannon fire at them. So the Afghan king, Abdur Rahman Khan in the 19th century destroyed also the upper part of the face of the large figure during a military campaign against the Hazara rebellion in the area. However, during Taliban takeover in 1996, this is a very interesting point that I'm making now, and interesting information, that Afghan fine art was protected by art masters at the Sinai Art School. The professors often hid, un-Islamic paintings from the viewpoint of from the Taliban, when they would visit and inspect. Other artists used watercolor over oil painting to conceal faces and images not approved by the Taliban, but those memories are still alive for millions of Afghans, as fear and as fear and chaos continues to engulf Afghanistan in the aftermath of Taliban takeover of the country. More than 350 artists, cultural workers, and art organizations have signed an open letter urging the United States government to protect Afghan artists. Now released on August 24 by a group named Artists for Afghanistan, the missive calls on the Biden administration to include Afghan artists, performers, writers, dramatists, filmmakers, photographers, visual journalists, and other cultural workers in the category of at-risk individuals, facing immediate danger, saying they must be included in evacuation plan and visa policy revisions. This statement was also endorsed by several arts and human rights organizations, including PEN America, the Authors Guild, Creative Capital, CEC Arts Link, For Freedom, which is another organization, Magnum Foundation, and many others. So in the long run, I don't see a very healthy, very conducive creative atmosphere or for the flourishment of art in Afghanistan. and music, I'm not sure, although I believe that the traditional instrumental music, which is very much culturally ingrained, musical instruments like lute instruments like rubab and such may survive. But the future of art and music is bleak.
Very
It's
unfortunate.
uncertain. It's
Very unfortunate. Yeah, in fact, you mentioned about many of the organizations who were advocating for the repatriation of the artists and musicians and others. And I think UNESCO has a great role in terms of preserving some of the art and because and the galleries and the statues and others as cultural heritage. I'm not sure what's happening, but there's so much of confusion, and even in the UN, the roles are so fluid. And really, when it becomes too late, then they wake up, unfortunately.
And by the way, this also happened in Pakistan during Ziaul Haq's period. When I was an art student, many of the exhibitions were, Jamaat-e-Islami, Jamiyat students used to come and destroy paintings of art teachers, and this has been happening even in Pakistan during early 1980s, mid 1980s.
That's a very unfortunate part. Now, thank you very much, Nadeem. I know you have been sitting here for a long time and you're not very well also.
No, I'm very well, unexpectedly, I'm very well and I'll stay. Don't worry.
Okay, thank you, because you had a jab and you said to me that, you may feel a little bit different today, but thank you for coming, and please stay on if you can. The last speaker is Professor Habibul Khondker. And he is the professor of College of Humanities and Social Sciences at Zayed University, United Arab Emirates in Abu Dhabi. Prior to this appointment, he was the associate professor of Singapore National University. Professor Khondker is the co-chair of Research Committee on Social Transformation and Sociology of the International Sociological Association, which is a very important organization. He has written a lot on globalization, and he calls also globalization, Asian globalization, migration governance, secularism, democracy, and cricket. So that's something that he also had written quite extensively. He edited a number of books and a lot of publications. I don't want to go to his profile now. And I'll ask him a question. Do you think, Professor Khondker, that it was a walkover by US in favor of China? Why am I asking you this question is it looks like in the next 10 years' time, Afghanistan, if some kind of peace and stability or whatever can be preserved, I'm not saying they preserve or can be preserved externally also, it may be the Saudi Arabia of things like copper and lithium, for example, which will be very useful for running cars, electric cars in the next 10 years instead of the petrol car. So there's a lot of these resources that can be harnessed and exploited, and China could be the ultimate beneficiary with their allies. That's one aspect. But my question here is, what are the implications of this, again, quote unquote, debacle for the position of the US in the world as a scholar of global studies? And how do you see, what I mentioned about the walkover possible, that part, and the aspect of displacement of people, migration, and refugee crisis from this particular event? Would you take the floor, Professor Khondker? Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Khan, for giving me the opportunity and asking some very penetrating questions. Just to take the first question first, was it a walkover? No, it was not a walkover. It was a miscalculation on the part of the American administration. They had very poor intelligence They didn't know what was going on the ground. They relied too much on technology, which had its advantages, but when it came to actual intelligence on the ground, they were poorly equipped. And I'm hearing a number of American generals and military officers who served in Afghanistan. They're all in consensus on that. The intelligence failure is colossal, not the intelligence failure at the highest level, intelligence failure at the strategic level. So leaving aside that, I think the implication for globalization is significant, because for the last decade or so, or even before last decade, people are talking about, the scholars are talking about the impending and emerging Asian globalization, from Singapore, Mahbubani and others. So the discourse has been quite lively. And in the context of Asian globalization, what we see here, that American empire, American hegemony is on retreat. And this is one more example of the retreat of America. Although, the discourse of American retreat has been going on for some time, but there has been a debate that is it a retreat or is it a tactical retreat, that America is concentrating on other things. But now we see that in terms of military power, in terms of political influence, America is going back maybe to the Monroe Doctrine period and so on. So this is, interestingly, there are so many ironies involved. What we see in Mr. Biden's policy, he goes to Europe and he says, America is back. America is not back. Mr. Biden is following the so-called Trump doctrine, the Trump doctrine of withdrawal, the Trump doctrine of going back foot. That's what he is doing. He is actually shaping, giving shape, material shape to the ideas, sort of vague, inchoate ideas of Donald Trump. And that's very ironical. The other irony is that here, for the first time in history, we see Taliban in a way condemning terrorism, suicide bombing, carried out by ISK. And that's another irony, that Taliban is on the side of so-called the liberal world, sort of criticizing such activity. And of course, it's a great tragedy that unfolded yesterday. But leaving aside that, I'm just trying to contextualize, this sort of development in terms of regionalism, which is part of, globalization. So the new actors on the scene, the new kids in town, are of course China is the major rival, major economic rival to America. And now this gives an opportunity for China to take advantage of this vacuum, because China has been sort of neutral to it. China has not been trying to promote democracy. China has not been, a champion of human rights. And suddenly now, China can talk about moderation. China can talk about inclusive government in Afghanistan. That's very ironical. And China is now talking about human rights in Afghanistan, as well as protection of the rights of women and children. So they really want to see China, Afghanistan as a moderate Islamic state. And this was revealed in the most recent editorials in Global Times in China, which is sort of semi-official or almost official mouthpiece of Chinese system or Chinese regime. So I think these several ironies should not be missed out. But at the same time, if we look at the women's issues in China, again, I fully agree with Jovitta that there's the discourse of burqa versus non-burqa. No, and the other colossal error is that we see and we are told, via CNN, we are told that women's liberation in China began only after US invasion in 2001. That's a joke, Way back in Singapore time when I was teaching, I used to talk about Revolutionary Association of the Women of Afghanistan. And they were very active in the 90s. This organization goes back to late 1970s. And they were very active in the 1990s before and after the onset of Taliban. They were in exile and from Pakistan and from elsewhere. They have always been very active. So these are some of the materials that we need to bring in our discussion, in our discourse, to look at and to understand Afghanistan in proper context. But coming back to the regional context, I think a number of countries have things to gain. Iran on the one side, Pakistan, of course, Russia, China, the Shanghai Cooperation Organization. Afghanistan is not a member, Iran is not a member, but they are member in the waiting. They have observation status, the observer status.
Observers, yes.
Exactly. So these observers are likely to be members. I'm just imagining a future scenario when
there's a waiting room.
They're in the waiting room. So this 8-member organization, if it becomes a 12-member organization with the inclusion of Iran and Afghanistan, that would be a game changer. I tell you, that would be a game changer. So this organization, as the previous speaker correctly pointed out, is somewhat dormant. But again, India-Pakistan rivalry. But if they can put the rivalry aside and look at the big picture, that this is to be seen in the context of the rise of Eurasia, the rise of Asia, the Asian globalization, I think they can get mileage out of it in terms of global power balance shift. And I hope, that is in the making. I'm quite intrigued by the fact that China, Pakistan, Russia, they're just in conversation as to what is to be done in Afghanistan. And as previous commentators and speakers have pointed out, that Taliban 2.0 may be different from the earlier Taliban, not because they have changed their soul, not because they have changed their ideological position, but the global context has become very different. And they have become somewhat globalized, by their travel, by their negotiation, by their being overseas. And they have seen that you cannot simply ignore, you cannot withdraw from globalization, you cannot withdraw from the international regime. So the only option, the only way you can withdraw is to become a North Korea. The other is that you become a strategic partner. You engage with the world in your own terms, and that would be like Iran. So again, in this world of misinformation, we were given this impression after the Iranian Revolution that Iran has gone back to the Middle Ages. And many of us, so-called educated people, had that kind of notion that what's going on in Iran. But as I checked facts, the fact was in the post so-called Islamic regime in Iran, the first vice president was a woman in Iran. People lost out on that. And then I remember meeting a group of top-notch Indian physicists, who work in particle physics and all that. And they said, oh, we are coming back from Iran. I said, why did you go to Iran? And they said, some of the top-notch physicists are there in Iran. So they had this physics conference in Iran. This is amazing. So people ignore, some of the facts, and they simply look at, okay, what they read in the newspaper, and what they watch on CNN. But if we dig down, if we go into a deeper understanding of what's going on, the shifts in the global system, I'm still optimistic despite the great tragedy that happened yesterday. The other implication is the rift between Europe and America. Let us not forget that not only American soldiers died in the last 20 years, 2,000 plus, 2,500 or so, 1,200, about that number, NATO soldiers died. And they felt betrayed because they were not consulted. The British diplomats were saying that we were kept in the dark, that Biden would declare withdrawal, and it's an unilateral withdrawal, so to speak. So this is a bad sign insofar as the West is concerned, that there's a rift. But this is an opportunity for the rising Asia. The Asian globalization has begun. And I think if they can take advantage of this, and they can, and if the Afghan regime, if they walk the talk, they really have to walk the talk. It's not enough to say that we'll have an inclusive government. They have to prove it. They have to show it. So if the new government, carries out their promises, things may not be as bad as doomsday scenario as some of the commentators in the media are portraying, because it gives an opportunity, because it brings a closure to one phase of what some writers are calling imperialism. So that phase is over. And then I would just point out one thing before I take off. The last point is that one really needs to go back to Washington papers. which was released by, Washington Post 2019. It's a plethora of information, amazing information, that we look at America, and America goes around the world to Bangladesh and elsewhere saying, oh, your state is failing. There's a state failure in the United States as well. I mean, you read that.
Right.
People didn't know what was going on, and they were spending billions of dollars. One estimate puts $2 trillion completely wasted. The bulk of the money has gone to the military, US military and Afghan military, and they were paper tigers, as the recent events have just shown. So 2% actually went for development, and we have development experts who can attest that. 2% and 98% went to the military and all this useless, activities. And you talk about corruption of the regime. What about systemic corruption that was built in Afghanistan for 20 years? People didn't know how to spend the money, what to do with the money. That was an amazing situation. People came, they went back, the soldiers, they carried out the mission and they didn't know what their mission was, and it's all in the Afghanistan papers of Washington Post. So I'm quite fascinated by these developments. I'm also very saddened by these things. So it's quite the glass is half full, half empty. We really don't know what's going to happen. I mean, there could be another ISK bombing, God forbid. If nothing happens, if Taliban's actually collaborate and if they become smarter and they think, no, they have to engage with the world. And if they can create this roadmap that how are they going to rule? It's one thing to take over the government. It's another thing to consolidate an administration, another thing to run the country. I'm quite encouraged by one interview that I saw. The mayor of Kabul is a courageous man. He said, I serve the people. I'm not going to run away. Why should I leave the country? If Mr. Ghani, Ashraf Ghani, showed that courage and that wisdom and said, look, I'm here. Let's come, let's talk, let's face the consequence. It would be a different scenario. It won't be a debacle the way we are thinking of it. So I'll stop there and I'll go back to Mr. Khan. Thank you.
Thank you very, very much, Professor Khondker. I think indeed very fascinating, and you have opened new dimensions in our discussion today. I had seen a number of comments popping up, and I think we are done with the panelists' discussions already now. It is an hour and 34 minutes we have spent, I think, which is pretty fine. Now we can take some questions. And I don't know how that can be sorted out in terms of who'll answer that. I've seen somebody called Dr. Anne Vogel, who has sent a number of very, very pertinent questions and comments, but we can take many of these comments. Now, can I ask the person or persons who are on the other side of the screen, I can't see, who are managing these questions, the chat boxes, if I can see some of. Can we have some of the questions on the screen, please? Okay, these are the questions that have come. Oh, very good. Well done. What kinds of challenges are going to face Taliban, or meaning, what would the Taliban face to run the governance in the coming days? This is one question. There was another question saying, US withdrawal has closed many chapters of crimes against humanity committed by foreign forces from 2001. I think this was a comment by Dr. Anne Vogel, as far as I remember. There was it's a question, it's a comment rather than a question. And there's something to do with Jovitta Thomas. What do the Taliban, what does it mean actually? Fuzzy language and hiding plans, using the Western language of inclusion to diffuse anxiety over their ongoing human rights violation and divide the world community. I think it is a question or not, I'm not sure. Yes, let's stop on these three now for the time being, and then we can go to the second screen. Now, First one is what kind of challenges the Taliban are going to face in terms of running the government. Who would answer this question? You can raise your hands in terms of, there is a, you can raise your hand through this icon, I think somewhere. Okay, yes, okay, Nadeem, you would like to answer this question. Okay, sure.
I think Taliban will be facing several challenges because, as very, amicably discussed by Professor Amin Saikal, that they will be facing challenges regarding political legitimacy within Afghanistan, and then international recognition and international funding, because they will be dependent on IMF and United States of America for survival. China will, regional powers will be investing in Afghanistan, but I don't think they can be that kind of donors, which US and American, they have that infrastructure which US and US allies has. So they will be facing, both. So the three main challenges: legitimacy, credibility, inclusiveness, and what kind of inclusiveness, whether that inclusiveness will be acceptable to all stakeholders within Afghanistan and the international community, and international legitimacy and recognition and international funding.
And also perhaps, how do they deal with their own ally in one way, soft allies such as IS and others, who will also be willing to take some share in the cake. So
yeah, of course.
That, okay. Now the second question is from Anne Vogel, if I'm not wrong. She mentions here that.
Sorry, this is not my question.
Sorry?
I have to intervene. This is not my question. My question is number 3.
Oh, okay. Your question is number 3. Okay, let's go to number 2, whoever has mentioned that. The second question was, the US withdrawal means closing the crimes against humanity chapter committed by the foreign forces from 2001. I ask Chris Blackburn, if you would like to answer this question. Chris, if you're around.
Yeah, I think accountability is something that we need. Whether it's US forces or NATO allies, and there were a lot of people who didn't like the drone campaign. They didn't like that there was so much collateral damage. So I think all parties and all stakeholders in it who are concerned with Afghanistan, we shouldn't close the chapters on crimes against humanity, because as an international order, we need accountability. And if we don't have accountability, then we have countries like China, like Pakistan, thinking they can get away with murder like they did when they thought they could get away with genocide during the Liberation War of 1971. I mean, we're still, 40, 50 years after that, we're still having a lack of accountability. And I think that's probably one of the big problems in South Asia, is governments thinking they can do what they like without, and to hell with the consequences. So I think you're right. It is quite a loaded question, but I think you're right. Countries do need to be made accountable for their own behavior.
As long as, this is kept in the radar screen for future, I think that will be pretty useful. The third point to the question, to Jovitta Thomas, is, what do the Taliban mean by, I think, the women emancipation perhaps, or inclusiveness. Yes, fuzzy language and hiding plans, using Western language of inclusion. I think we have covered it quite a bit. Jovitta, would you like to add something on the third question, which Anne Vogel has mentioned?
Briefly, very interestingly, so a small anecdote. 2 days back, the Taliban announced the results of the Khondker exam. The Khondker is a university entrance exams for all government universities in Afghanistan. And they put out the news that it was a young high school student from Kabul, a young girl, who has scored the highest marks, and this came after the Taliban took over the government. So what we're hearing is very mixed messages. We do hear that they're, what they mean by how they will interpret the Sharia law remains to be seen. They have told government women staff to stay home, but again, promising security. And we did see a few women's protests in media, and the Taliban were around actually protecting them. So whether this is a pose or a softer side to show the international media, or this is where they are heading to, remains to be seen. One thing I do know from a lot of Afghan women who I call friends, who in very senior places, they're desperate to get out. Maybe the fear from what they experienced or what they've heard of from the Taliban version 1 remains. So the educated Afghan women, the Hazara women, the Uzbek women, the minority women, they remain terrified of the Taliban, especially Shia minority groups like Ismailis. Their women remain terrified of the Taliban. So we need to wait and see what their stance towards women and minorities will really be once they set up government. For now, we do have to accept that they've not formed the government yet. So there's a lot of blame game going around about who's actually responsible. Over for me.
Thank you. Thank you, Jovitta. In fact, we were trying to contact some people in the Hazara community here, women.
Can I just add a little bit here, if you permit me?
Nadeem, yes, please.
Yeah, I think these Talibans probably have this awareness that none of the regional powers are really have that much concern about human rights and women's rights in Afghanistan. What all they are bothered about or would be concerned about is their own economic gains, including USA. I mean, USA has been using this very discourse of human rights as a political tool. What about Saudi Arabia? Have they raised any voice of the human rights and women's rights violation in Saudi Arabia, where only recently women were, given rights to even drive a car? So Afghan Taliban probably are pretty aware of this fact that human rights discourse is also a political tool, and they might do some tokenistic kind of things, but they won't do anything substantial because they know nobody's concerned.
There's a funny phrase we use, gender rights and human rights, women's rights in Afghanistan for the US and the international community, the last to come and the first to go. It's all lip service.
Absolutely, in many cases.
Yes,
Thank
that's
you.
right.
Okay, Sakina Nazari, I think she's from the Kabul University, a student of second year or third year. I have a question. Why Taliban doesn't want women to go to university for education and for work or other social activity? However, they do his speech for international conference like now. I'm not sure what is meant by the last line. Jovitta, do you like to take this for a few seconds and answer? Why do the the Taliban don't want the women to go to university or, to get education or to work? I think it's a very, very naive question, very simple person with a lot of simplicity. She goes to, university, and I think it's a very, how do you call it, emotional question she has asked.
We've debated this a lot, so just to be
very innocent way of asking.
The question for her, it's a very personal question. So Shakina, the simple answer is the Taliban officially haven't stated that women should not go to university. They, in fact, in a number of press conferences, have actually said women can go. Officially, they have not closed down universities. What we need to see and be careful about in all the international pressure that's going to be placed on the government formation, one of the conditions the international community should place on the Taliban or whatever form of government is going to take over Afghanistan is what would be at the basic women's rights in terms of education, higher education in particular. This is a window of opportunity for many, but like many speakers already mentioned, it is actually a point that no international community will press too hard. So we may lose what we gained, or we may have to wait and see what Taliban will do. Over from me.
Thank you. The other one question to the speakers. should the acceptance of Taliban not start at the diplomatic high table, not accepting Taliban negotiations without women groups being participants? If the Taliban cannot do that, then how could they be trusted as government? I think I've understood the inner meaning of this question. This has been also answered before. Professor Khondker, do you want to take it? Or, basically what they're trying to say here is, what's the point of negotiations? What do these negotiations mean unless we can really have some firm commitment from the Taliban?
It's again a matter of engagement, because if you remember that after the American intervention in 2001, initially it was a success. They could remove the Taliban from the government, but then within 2 years, they got completely distracted. They went to Iraq, which was completely unnecessary, and they did not focus on, they did not keep their eyes on the ball. And the same thing could happen here. Right now, remember, Afghanistan needs money. Their central bank foreign reserve is about $9 billion. The $9 billion is not in Afghanistan, they're outside of Afghanistan. They only have $10 million or so. So international community can use that as a leverage, use that as a lever, that either you follow these rules, if you behave, you conform to the norms, and the norms are not just international norms. Norms are, I would say, universal global norms that would benefit all the citizens across the board in Afghanistan. If you do that, if you fail to do that, you'd be punished financially, economically, there would be sanctions. So if international community is unified in their response and they lay out the rules, that these are the rules that need to be followed, I think, some of these demands can be met. But if you just ignore them, you said, okay, let them do whatever they want to do, then I don't see any possibility of sustaining, the spirit of inclusion, sustaining, this sort of idea of allowing women to go back to work. Right now, they're saying, and based on the fact that 50% of the Taliban soldiers are illiterate, frankly, and they have no idea. They have never been to a city. First time they're in Kabul, and they are not used to seeing women. So the leadership, as if, if I accept their rhetoric, that's what they're saying, that we are asking women to stay home for the time being. And once everyone gets the message, everyone on the ground, all the soldiers get the message that, no, we are changing our tack, then you can come out and go back to school, college, and your places of work. How far that is true, I don't know, but these are the lines that should be pushed by the international community. Thank you.
Mr. Khan,
Thank you.
Mr. Khan, through you, I would like to ask Mr. Khondker one question. So what does international community mean? Because we know that according to the UN Charter, without United Nations, no intervention is allowed according to Article 2, Paragraph 7. And there is a certain situation when UN can intervene, but no individual state, even a group of states, cannot intervene into the internal affairs of a state on the violation of human rights and other things. It must be through United Nations. And what is the role of the United Nations at present? Because the single-handed intervention is never accepted under international law.
Sure. I think I wanted a question, really. I mean, not statement. Thank you, Nakib. I'm not sure. We were just supposed to see some of the slides here. Your entry was sudden to me, but thank you. Would you like to take this question as in a short way, Professor Khondker?
Yeah, just one line that right now, I mean, a sensible solution, not a solution, a sensible move would be for the United Nations to send UN peacekeeping force. Ideally, the repatriations and the movement of people should take place under the supervision of the United Nations peace mission. So I wish the United Nations takes a role and they send their peacekeeping force, at least initially, to see things are in place, that things fall into the places. I think it's very important, and they actually can use this as a leverage that you get your money back, provided these things are assured in your constitution and the formation of the government. And the Taliban, if they're sensible, they should also collaborate with the international community. By that I mean United Nations per se right now. Thank you.
Thank you.
Mr. Khan.
The last question I want to ask Professor Amin Saikal. The question here is, what are the common challenges for the neighboring countries at present with the debacle in Afghanistan? Is Professor Amin Saikal online, please?
Yes, thank you very much.
Yeah, my request to the operators there, the host, you may wish to mute me and others off when Professor Saikal is talking or others are talking, please. Thank you.
The Taliban certainly poses serious challenges to the Central Asian republics bordering Afghanistan, and that is Tajikistan, Uzbekistan, Turkmenistan. And those states have already securitized their borders, and also Russia has deployed forces along the border between Tajikistan and Afghanistan. So there is this fear that despite the promise by the Taliban that they will not be spreading their gospels into neighboring countries, and particularly Central Asia, there is a strong view among the Central Asian that it is very possible that the Taliban victory in Afghanistan will provide more incentives for some of the radical Islamist movements in Central Asia. And so therefore, I think that's something that also Russia is very cognizant of. And I think that's something on which also Russia will bargain, that if there's going to be an inclusive government, it will have to be a responsible government which would not really pose any threat or will not allow the Taliban to pose any threat to the Central Asian Republic. I mean, in the case of Iran, although Iranians are very happy about the Americans being out of the region, and of course, the United States will also pull out all 2,500 troops from Iraq before the end of this year. But at the same time, I'm sure that the Iranian leadership is very conscious of the fact that the Taliban is an extremist Sunni group, and something like 20% of Afghanistan's population is made up of the Shias. And of course, Iran champions the cause of the Shia Islam. And therefore, they will be very careful to make sure that Shias are protected in Afghanistan. And that's one of the reasons that the Iranians have been courting certain Taliban elements. And of course, very recently, they hosted at the Taliban delegation, and a former Iranian foreign minister, Javad Zarif, had a meeting with the Taliban leaders. And I do recall my own personal meeting with Zarif in 2017, and he told me that, look, of course, as far as we are concerned, Taliban are going to play a very important role in determining the future of Afghanistan, and therefore we have to really establish contacts with them, and we have done so. So I think they will be very. But of course, also in the case of Pakistan, and Pakistan has got its own problems. It's got its own radical Islamist movements, and of course, it's got its own Taliban. And I think this development may really come to bite Pakistan, may come back to bite Pakistan. And I think that's something that also the Pakistani leadership will have to be very conscious of. I mean, some people have been talking about Imran Khan and so on. I mean, Imran Khan is just simply a front, but it is really the military, and more specifically, the military intelligence side that really runs the show. And they are the ones who are really running the Pakistan's Afghanistan policy. So it really doesn't matter what Imran Khan says. I think it's more what the ISI really does. And I think obviously you will be very, very careful to make sure that the Taliban victory in Afghanistan will not really provide too much incentives or encouragement to the Pakistani Taliban and certain other the extremist groups in that country. Thank you very much, and thanks for having me. I've got to go. It's getting very late for me.
No. I know, Professor Saikal. Thank you very much for staying so long. And on behalf of SAIST, I would like to thank you, although I'm not a part of SAIST, but I would like to thank you for taking the invitation, coming here, speaking, taking questions, and staying for such a long time. Appreciate it very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks very much.
Yeah, we need to stop in maybe perhaps in 5 minutes. I'm seeing a number of questions here. Some of these things have been answered. There's a gentleman from Nepal, Dharmendra Dhami, and it's to do with SAARC. I think we have heard from Zahid Ahmed, and I think more or less it's the same similar kind of questions. So that's that has been answered. Because of the time issue, we have to really finish this. Can I see more questions, please? Can you scroll up to some of the questions, please? I've seen that, and in terms of the good governance in Afghanistan, the Sharia law factor, the gender equality, transitional justice be established. I think we could spend about an hour or more on these things, but we have discussed this at length, some of these issues. Perhaps in another occasion, we will do that again. Can you go to the other slide, please? Thank you. Yeah, another one. We have seen this. Yeah, we talked about the China and Russia go for non-aggression pacts. Look, I don't know who to answer this, but I think we have dealt with it to some extent already. The geopolitical issues, the issue to do with the regional cooperation, I think we've done with it. Now, can we go to the other one? Well, Mr. Mukherjee, would you like to take the last one, the last question? Dr. Mukherjee, are you there?
Yes,
Dr.
I'm
Mukherjee? Yeah, the last one, if you can just make it very short. The last one, it says here, the US withdrawal has closed many chapters in Crime Against Humanity. That's all have been said and done with. He talks about, or she talks about, to avoid famine, how do reconstruction of the infrastructure can happen, and how to provide education, health, and avoid famine and food security, ensuring that. So can you just talk about the food security again here? The person is asking, how can we restore it, or how can we make sure there's the food security?
There has to be two sets of measures. This improving health and education facilities, empowerment of women, they're long-term measures, including increasing the productivity of land through diversification, by changing the cropping pattern to food crops from cash crops. But that's the long-term thing. The immediate term thing is what the World Food Program does, is to provide food directly to the indigenous people. There is no escape from the fact that if you want to avoid a large-scale famine in Afghanistan, there has to be a large amount of food aid from the different countries which have food surplus, as well as for the World Food Program. So immediately, I don't see there is any prospect of famine being avoided without food aid. In the long term, of course, improvement in the distribution of water, improvement in the farming techniques, movement from cash crop by cash crop. You all understand what cash crop is grown in Afghanistan. Food crop, these are long-term measures. This won't happen tomorrow. So immediate, and I can just foresee a famine setting in. The way out is provide food aid. But the US and other countries, China also has done for a long time in North Korea. So that's the only way out.
Right. Thank you very much, Dr. Amitava Mukherjee. Let's go to the last slide, and then we'll finish our discussion today.
Dr. Khan, may I make a small point?
Oh, yeah, sure. Okay. Mr. Abul Hassan Chaudhry is our ex-State Minister for Bangladesh, Foreign Affairs State Minister. you can make a point here, sure, little point here, sure. We'll just finish.
Thank you very much. Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. In the first place, I would like to thank you for including me in the company of scholars and panelists and people who have been deeply involved with research. I have been, as you so well know, a grassroots worker of the historic and the most authentic political party in Bangladesh, the leader of which and the leader of the country was the father of the nation, Bangabandhu Sheikh Mujibur Rahman. And both you, Dr. Khan and Dr. Habib Khondker, were stalwarts in the liberation war. I make two brief points. One is, we have discussed Afghanistan, we have discussed Taliban, we have discussed India, China, Russia, the whole world. We have not talked about a single leader. You see, this was our advantage. Bangladesh was united in the clarion call of that great personality. And of course, that journey was rudely brought to a halt by the assassination of most members except our Prime Minister Sheikh Hasina and her younger sister Sheikh Rehana. Now, my brief point is this, that to look at the United Nations is in most cases chasing a mirage. Let us, for the time being, regionally think of it. Hope that both India and China, ancient civilizations who for thousands of years have given politics, maths, international relations and economy to the world, can ring fence their problems and come to an arrangement in Afghanistan, because this is vital for the region. Why depend on a power whose history has been to leave you with a few boots and helmets and run at the very first opportunity? And here, as a simple citizen, as I described myself, a grassroots worker at one time and now totally rootless, I believe that Bangladesh, which enjoys excellent relations with all the countries of the region, and many Bangladeshis are working in Afghanistan, in NGOs, and our honorable Prime Minister has shown such magnanimity in taking in these Rohingya refugees unprecedented, should be invited to bring about a situation where India and China, with all the, I am not hoping for the impossible, that in a moment they will forget all the differences, that their rivalries, but for the sake of the region, if stability is not there, neither the BRI of India, of China, neither the BRI of China, nor the advancement of the region will take place. And here also I believe that SAARC can be revitalized with some degree of sincerity. You see, the politics is a matter of changing realities. But I think I should conclude there. This is a very brief, fractured, fragmented thoughts, but I'm very honored to be in the presence of scholars.
Thank you very much.
Comes from that of being a worker and a practitioner.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much
for organizing an excellent session.
No, thank you very much. Okay, we have to finish here. I think here we have got a small thing from Jovitta. I couldn't read it and it left. So, okay, now let us conclude our today's program here. I know there are plenty of questions still there, and there are plenty of people still from the first minute still are available behind the screen. Now, first of all, I would like to thank all the panelists for this, for contribution they have made to this webinar. Thank you to the host, SAIST, South Asian Institute for Social Transformation in Dhaka. And thank you to the people who are really behind the scene. I can't see them, but they have done all the hard work in terms of the technological, keeping it moving. I've asked them to give me the names by SMS. Mitu, Sarah, Tanjila, Anmol, and Jewel. Thank you very much. Thank you all the panelists for staying with us. And we hope to carry on with this sort of seminars again, and perhaps again on Afghanistan issue as things unfold in future. And thank you again, everybody, and all who have participated from their homes and other places. Thank you very much.
Thank you all. Thank you, the audience, especially the audience.
Thank you, Mr. Khan.
Thank you.
Thank you all very much. It was a very riveting session. Thank you.
Thank you, sir. Thank you for coming. Thank you for joining us. Good to see you.
But you should have invited a legal educationist, because there are many things that that
This
touch
is the
upon
Okay, well,
touch upon the legal issues.
let's finish this conference now, and let's get out of perhaps the thing. We have all crossed our time. Thank you.